All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So hello, this is the SpreadJS v13 webinar. My name is Kevin Ashley, and today I will be going over the new features that we added in v13 and how you can leverage them in your application. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat window, and I will go over them at the end of the presentation. Before we get started, I will give you a little bit of info about myself. I am the product manager for SpreadJS and have been working on the Grape City team for 4+ years now. I graduated from North Carolina State University with a bachelor's degree in computer science with a concentration in game design. When I'm not working on improving SpreadJS, I like to work on creating my own video games. As you probably already know, SpreadJS is our customizable spreadsheet library that we created to help with data-driven visualizations, including spreadsheets, reports, dashboards, and forms. With v13, we focused on some Excel parity features, but our main focus was on improving form creation, giving developers more tools to create complex forms quickly, making the user experience for editing those forms easy and familiar. In this presentation, I'll be going over all the features that we have added to SpreadJS v13. We will start with the big features for calculation and form creation, move on to editing features, and then finally end with enhancements made to our chart and table implementations. To start off, we will talk about the new enhancements made to the calculation engine. The first, and arguably the biggest feature we will go over, is dynamic arrays. These are essentially formulas that can return multiple results. With dynamic arrays, results will automatically spill into adjacent cells to the right and below. It should be noted that this can change the way that some formulas work, so it is not enabled by default. But you can turn this functionality on by setting the spread.options.allow dynamic array property to true. The functions we added include filter, rand array, sequence, sort, sort by, and unique. We also added the spill range and implicit intersection operators to give the option to reference an entire array or return a single value from a result. Using these kinds of formulas can drastically increase the performance of your application, as they can replace large numbers of formulas with singular dynamic array formulas, which I will now show you in the following demo. So right now we have a demo of the filter function. So in this case, we want to filter out all the products that have greater than 5,000 units. So as you can see, these cells don't actually have formulas in them. The only cell that has a formula in it is I4, which the results are spilled into the other cells in this array. So similar functionality for sequence, where it just generates a sequential list of numbers in an array. And unique, which just finds the unique values in a specified list. v13 gives you the ability to audit your formulas by tracing through the dependent and precedent cells of a formula. This is especially useful for complex workbooks, helping users identify calculation bottlenecks, check errors, locate circular references, and detect inconsistencies without needing manual review of every formula in a workbook. This essentially gives users the ability to see how a change will affect other cells in their workbook. Now I will go over the enhancements and features that we added to help make creating forms easier. Range templates are one of the most powerful features we have added in v13, as it gives users the ability to design complex templates without compromising the layout of their application. These templates can be created on separate sheets containing multiple rows and columns of different sizes. That template can then be used in other sheets within a single cell. Making changes to the template is easy as well, as layout changes will not need to be made in your dashboard, report, or spreadsheet in order to accommodate those template changes. And you can see an example of that here on the images in the slide. So this last image right here is the actual template, which is then used in single cells in another workbook up here, and we fill in the data there. We recently added a predefined button implementation known as cell buttons. These can be added within the margins of a cell and can use specific built-in commands or custom commands defined by the developer. With little code, developers can add buttons to their implementations of Spread, which can make creating interactive forms simple and quick, as I will now show in the following demo. So right here are just a few examples of the different cell buttons we have. And so you can see all the different styles of buttons that you can add to your application. And we have different commands that you can bind. So in this case, this magnifying glass is actually bound to the zoom capabilities of Spread, just one of the built-in commands. This arrow is actually bound to show a cell dropdown. And these are a new feature that I will go over in the next slide. But for right now, you can see that it just opens a color picker. Another feature that helps with implementing forms is cell dropdowns, which are built-in menus that can be added within cells. This includes standard and workflow lists and specialized dropdowns like calendars, slicers, calculators, and color pickers. Similar to cell buttons, these dropdowns were implemented to help make creating interactive forms, reports, and dashboards easy to do without having to use a lot of code to create complex drop-down menus. And I'll show you what those drop-downs look like. So here we have some simple list drop-downs. You can just have text. You can add icons to that text. You can have different groups and trees. We also have the date time picker, which essentially allows you to pick a specific date to show in the cell. A slider to select a number, and you can choose what the min and maximum are, as well as the different iterations of numbers. The color picker, as you just saw, and the workflow list. Now this one's cool because you can actually choose what the user sees depending on what options they select. So right now I only have new, but if I select new, now I have open as an option. And if I select open, I have even more options. So as a developer, you can define this whole tree that the user can go through to define what options they have available to them. We also added some new list cell types with V13, building on some existing cell types that are already in SpreadJS. These are lists contained in a single cell for radio buttons, checkboxes, and standard buttons. When creating forms, user choices can be provided within a single cell without having to implement separate buttons for each option. This should have less of an impact on the layout of your application, and I'll go ahead and show you what those look like. So starting off with radio list, you can see we have a bunch of different radio button options in this cell that the user can choose from. And when we reference that value, it just returns the option that the user selected, or the index of the option. And you can use code to get the actual value of that. We have checkbox as well, pretty similar, except in this case, the value is an array of those indices that were chosen. And the same thing goes for button list. Cell states give you control over how a cell responds to different actions, which can be useful in letting the user know which cells can and can't be changed, among a lot of other different things. The different states include hover, invalid, read-only, edit, active, and select. The main use case for this is with responsive forms, highlighting specific fields that require user input or marking fields with incorrect information, which I can now show you in our inventory form demo. So this entire form is implemented within a SpreadJS instance. So all this text is within different cells in that workbook. But as you can see, with cell states, I can choose to highlight the specific fields that the user needs to edit based on where their mouse is hovering. So for example, this is definitely a cell, but it doesn't highlight when I hover over it because I don't have any cell states bound to it. The previous features, as well as cell padding and labels, make creating input forms in SpreadJS easy and quick. I actually wrote a blog about how to utilize all of these features to effectively create a bug report form that users can edit within SpreadJS. A link to that blog and demo can be found in this slide, but I will go ahead and show you what that demo looks like now. So here we have a simple list of all the bugs that were reported, in this case just one. So let's say I want to edit some of these properties in this bug. So I can use this edit cell button, and that will open up another SpreadJS instance. In this case, this is our form that I've implemented for creating and editing bug reports. So I have a workflow list for the status. I have a simple list with grouping for the product, a slider for priority, a calendar for submission date, and a calculator for estimated hours. So let's say we want to change this priority to 3. Okay. And then we'll go ahead and click the Submit Issue button. And now you can see that the priority got updated to 3. There is so much more that you can do with this, but this is just hitting the tip of the iceberg on it. Now we'll go over some small changes we made to editing in SpreadJS that makes cells and data easier to manipulate. Dynamic sizing automatically resizes rows and columns in the viewport to fit as the developer defines them. Different rows and columns can have static sizing or dynamic sizing, which can be affected by resizing the spread instance itself. Dynamic sizing lets you easily implement responsive displays with little effort. And I'll go ahead and show you what that looks like. So in this case, the film and lead studio columns have dynamic sizing set on them, whereas the other columns just have static sizing. So you see, when I resize film, the only other column that actually resizes is lead studio. This way, it keeps all of the columns on this window at the same time. Now this also works if I were to resize the window itself. That's pretty much all there is to dynamic sizing. The other kind of sizing we added was split resizing. With this enabled, columns and rows can be resized relative to adjacent columns and rows, which can help with preserving specific layouts. We added this feature to make designing complex forms and report layouts easier without resizing or moving cells that aren't adjacent. And this is what that looks like. So right now, the column and row resize is set to normal. So I can resize these much like you would expect. But I can also change that to split for both column and row. So if I were to resize this company name column, the only other column that would resize is the city column. And the same thing goes for rows. If I were to resize this first row, it will only resize the second row. Another great feature we added in V13 was the ability to rotate text within cells. This allows users to satisfy specific requirements they might have, not only rotating text, but in some cases extending that rotated text into adjacent cells. This feature was meant to match Excel's implementation of text rotation, making sure that imported and exported Excel files don't lose their rotation. And now I'll show you a short demo of how to set the rotation for cells. So here we have a use case where the text in this column has already been set to vertical, and the cells in the row headers have been set to an angle. So let's say I wanted to change this angle. I could change it to 30, for example, and then set it, and it'll change the angle of that text. Now in code, this is pretty simple. You simply just want to set the text orientation property on the cell. That's all there is to it. Another feature we added was auto merging, which can help you consolidate data in a workbook by automatically merging cells that have the same data. However, the underlined cells are not converted to spans, but rather are just visually merged, allowing the selection and editing of those individual cells. You can choose how this merge happens with the different merge types, including column, row, row column, and headers. We implemented this functionality to help with formatting hierarchical data without having to change the underlying data source. And I will show you what that looks like. So right now, the auto merging is set to column row. So it will first merge the columns and then the rows. But I can change that to the other types of merge. And as you can see, let's take today's show, for example. While this does show as one cell, I can still individually select and edit all of the cells that are in there. So for example, if I wanted to change this to today, you'll see it'll automatically unmerge those cells and just keep these two cells merged. This is a way to essentially clean up your workbook without having to actually change any of the data that shows in there. Pixel scrolling is another feature we added to make editing easier for your users. It gives developers control over how many pixels the spread instance is scrolled when using the scroll wheel or scroll bar. This can be useful for situations where some spreadsheets, reports, or dashboards might have large amounts of data that take up multiple lines in a single cell. Without pixel scrolling, the entire row or column would be scrolled over in one tick of the scroll wheel, which can be especially frustrating for reports and dashboards. I will now show you our demo that sets the pixel scrolling so you can see how this works. So right now pixel scrolling is turned on, but let me turn it off just to show you how this works. So with pixel scrolling turned off, if you were to scroll, you'll notice it scrolls about 3 to 4 rows at a time. And this can be really frustrating for large cells. So let's say you have a lot of text that spans multiple lines in the single cell. And let's say you have that for a lot of these rows. Now if I scroll, it scrolls over multiple rows at once, which can be really frustrating, especially if you have like dashboards that may have charts or spark lines inside single cells, and you'll scroll over them in one tick. But if I were to turn pixel scrolling on, now it only scrolls a certain number of pixels at a time, meaning that you can keep that important data on the screen even when the user is scrolling. The last few features I will go over are related to our chart and table implementations, which we added to improve the user experience. In V13, we enhanced a few different parts of our chart implementation, including legend positions, axis unit selections, custom area borders, hover styles, logarithmic axes, trend lines, and error bars. We added these features to further support Excel chart exporting and customization. Most of the enhancements are pretty self-explanatory, but are all featured in our demos nonetheless. So you can see examples of a few of those charts. So we have error bars here, and then we have custom area borders on the pie charts here. Tables were also enhanced with more usability features, including more table layouts, context menu options, selection and navigation enhancements, and a total row. These enhancements provide a more Excel-like experience for your users, meaning that they won't have to learn a new interface and can stick to what they already know. And now I'll show you a demo of the navigation, context menu, and total row capabilities. So as you can see, we have a simple table here, and it already has a total row on it. In this case, the total row cell here is summing all of the cells in the column above it. But we have multiple options for what functions we want to set there. So let's say I want to set this to average. It'll average those cells instead. The cool thing about total row is you can do this for all the cells in that row. So you can set different formulas depending on whatever column you're in. We also implemented tab navigation. So typically when you're just in a workbook or worksheet, when you tab, it'll just tab to the next cell in that workbook. But for tables, we might not necessarily want this to happen because we want to keep the table on the screen. So instead, with tab navigation, it'll now move to the next line in the table. And this works for rows that are already there, but it can also work to add a row to the table. So say I get to the last cell in the table and I want to add another row. Well, if I press tab again, it'll automatically add a row, and I don't have to worry about adding that row manually. We also have the context menu. So normally when you right click on a cell in Spread, you have a bunch of different options that you can do. But we've added a few more options for inserting and deleting rows and columns when you're in a table. So if I right click on this row, let's say I want to delete it, now I have a delete option to delete the table row. And I do that, and it goes ahead and deletes it. And that concludes the SpreadJS V13 webinar. I've added links to our forums, demos, and blogs to this slide for your reference.